Le 25 février dernier, le Conseil des comptes unis de Prescott-Russell a entendu un rapport de mise à jour de la prestation des services d'incendie.
It's been almost a year since Ms. Wood has been with us to present the findings of the fire service report, which was done last June, at which time Council requested that we look at what priorities this group could work on, and we identified fire services being our number one priority. So this morning, Ms. Wood will be presenting the findings, and will be also proposing steps forward for this council so that we may or may not move ahead with the number one priority of the service delivery review.
The CIOs identified 6 that seem to be the best candidates for significant attention on the SDR front. And actually, I think you could say that the first one on that list, the IT support, doesn't really need much support or help from the CIO's committee. And the reason for that is it's already been moving forward for several years based on a strategy of the county IT department and support group bringing in and adding into their portfolio, if you want to call it that, the individual municipalities that understand the benefits of working together on that front. The second one on the list is fire services. And again, here, there has been some cross-municipality or inter-municipality service provision, but not a lot at this point. And then there are the other 4 that are listed here. And I will just say at the outset that you know your municipal and county budgets well enough to know that transportation is a large financial, it's a big ticket item in your budgets, as is environmental services. So you might wonder why fire services would be at the top of this list. And part of the reason is because there's already been considerable interest in finding a better way to work together. And I will come back to some elements of that in a minute. But so at the time we were here before with our broad view and our assessment of all 6 of these potential priorities for you, you received the report that we made at that time and then directed the CIOs to return to you with a recommendation on prioritization. So that's exactly what we're doing today, is bringing forward fire services as that first priority.
Selon la présentation, parmi les autres départements, les services d'incendie doivent être priorisés en raison de pressions spécifiques auxquelles ils font face.
In fire services, there are significant operating issues and implications, as well as capital. I know that every one of you sitting around the horseshoe here has seen your own municipality's asset management plans and knows the degree to which fire services is going to be making a call on your financial resources on the capital side, whether it's for upgrading fire stations and equipment or your fleet issues, those sorts of things. So that makes fire services a little bit different than some other services. But I'll also just mention that one of the other elements that is perhaps a little different here are some of the staffing challenges. You have now, across all the municipalities, roughly 375 full-time and volunteer firefighters, and you have some vacant positions that at the moment are not filled. And so there's a little bit more stress there than there might have been in past. And I would also ask you to remember, as we consider fire services, that the United Counties of Prescott and Russell, as of last May 2005, was identified as one of the highest growth areas of all of Ontario. I'm not sure if you're aware of that. I hope you are. But that means there's going to be, and unless the world changes, which it might, population and housing growth, and there will be additional requirements for fire services there, and service expectations, of course. So there are some elements here that are a little bit different from some other service. So way back in the beginning, when we were going through and creating the list of 6 that I've shared with you just a moment ago, the CIOs decided to actually just step back from fire services and actually try and reimagine, because of the kinds of pressures and the opportunities that exist, to reimagine fire services for this new era that we seem to be in. And the preliminary analysis that we've done, and CAO Parisian mentioned the amount of data analysis and work that the CAOs have been doing, suggests that there are opportunities to both improve services and manage costs. So if we move to our next slide then. So we decided that if we're reimagining the fire services, what would be the objectives of that process? And so I shared with you here the ones that we decided to focus on. And I want to take just a moment to speak in a little bit more detail to the fourth one, the shift to greater emphasis on fire prevention and public education. One of the things, the pieces of work that I did in concert with the CAOs was to take a look at how other counties particularly are dealing with fire services. And over the last number of years, there's been roughly half a dozen fire services reviews of different sizes, shapes, and configurations, some outside of an SDR process and some as an integral part of it. And there were a couple of themes that emerged from that I wanted to share with you as you deliberate on the recommendations today. One is that data seems to always emerge, or lack of data or lack of standardized data seems to always emerge as a consistent issue when we're reviewing fire services. I'm not necessarily talking about the United Counties of Prescott and Russell and your municipalities, but when others do these pieces of work, this is one of the things they find. And the second one is, and this is again specific to or more accentuated in rural areas, is that response times are extremely important. Your fire stations are extremely important. But what the research has been showing, and it's reflected in these other studies that I mentioned, is that ROI, if you're interested in ROI, where you can have the greatest impact on public safety related to fire services, is when you take add extra emphasis on fire prevention and public education around that. So if you tie that back to what I was telling you a moment ago about population growth, not to mention the households and the population you already have here, that's something to keep in mind as we go forward. We need to make sure that that's part of the discussion, part of the equation, because it is a core part, if not the core part, of a fire services mandate across your municipalities. And then I'll also just highlight, because it doesn't always come up, but integrating fire services master plans. Now you're doing like 8 of them, right? And it would make some sense to do one, reflecting the needs across the entire county. So I'm happy to answer questions on that if you wish. If we go on to our next slide then. So one of the conclusions that the CAOs arrived at was that our current configuration might not be the best one for the long term. I mentioned the capital issues that come up in fire services as they do in some other services. So you're going to be making decisions as municipalities, as an entire county, you're going to be making decisions based on a 20, 30, 40-year time horizon. What's best over that period of time? And that's a challenging situation, but this is not something where you make a decision this year and you get to reverse it all next year with no implications. So we want to take our time and do this right so that we're making the best choices for fellow citizens. And so I've added some extra elements here just to encourage you to think about why fire service is a little bit more complex. I mentioned the need to emphasize fire prevention and public outreach and communications a bit more than we may be doing now. Also, this is a very geospatial service. I mentioned fire stations and your ability to respond appropriately. I also just wanted to make sure that everyone understood that out of all the calls that you get across all your municipalities in the course of a year, 25% of them are false alarms. So just know that. But the next two most important or most significant types of calls are actually medical emergencies and motor vehicle collisions that your fire services support in both those cases. Actual fires are after that. There's a smaller number. Doesn't mean they're not important, but we would want to make sure that as we're thinking about how we might reimagine fire services for the next few years, that we don't miss the fact that some of those services that you provide through your fire services don't necessarily show up every day. I mean, if you happen to be driving past where a motor vehicle accident has taken place, you might see that. So I ask you to keep that in mind, that we need to broaden our scope, make sure that we take that into account. And that I've already mentioned long-term asset management. What we have now on the staffing front is sort of permanent full-time, volunteer firefighters, and a mix. In some cases, we've got a mix of both. That's going to be a pretty challenging, not impossible, but a challenging consideration to keep in mind as we go forward. As we look at how we want to deliver services, what mix of staffing is most appropriate there. So that'll take some time and attention. So we go on to our next slide then. So we've offered you, and I'm not going to go into this a lot because I'm pretty sure I'm almost out of time, if not out of time, and you have these recommendations in front of you anyway. But the proposal and the recommendation coming forward from the CAOs is to develop the procurement process that would allow you to retain neutral third-party consultant or consultants, depending on how that unfolds, to undertake the comprehensive study that I just gave you some highlights of what should be covered in that study. The second recommendation is that that study be funded by the United Counties because it is part of the SDR process, and that we follow the county's procurement process. Thirdly, that we actually put the consultants in the lead role and give them some independence to undertake this work, but still good accountability by reporting to a fire services steering committee. And we've shared with you a little bit about how we see that steering committee being constituted and how it would unfold. The timeline for this work, it would be roughly a year, might be a little bit less, but roughly a year. We would start, obviously, after we secure support of County Council and go through the procurement process, which will take some time to secure the right supports for us, and then we'd finish early in 2027. The fourth recommendation is that when it comes to that financing question that we mentioned in recommendation 2, that the CAO's steering committee would provide the county with a recommended budget allocation, and the CAO would then advise on the sources of that funding. So that's how we think that would unfold. I have already provided the CAO with some public domain budget numbers that would give you some guidance as to what that allocation might look like, but it also does depend on the scope of the RFP and or tenders that we would advocate, and also the timing and so on. So if we go to recommendation number 5, then the last one, this is just to give you some insight into what the consultants would do. And I've just bold-faced some of the major pieces of this. We actually have a much more extensive description of what that work plan might look like. But for the purposes of today's discussion and your ability to make good decisions today, we've kind of boiled it down into these 4 major categories. So I'll pause there. Happy to answer questions. And I also just want to thank the CAOs that came here today to demonstrate their support for the recommendations that we're bringing forward.
I think it'll be important to strategically include the councils and public presentations to make sure that there is no big surprise or concern growing throughout. I think our warden said earlier on, in the absence of information, we make our own in our heads. And so I think it's important that we keep everyone kind of abreast of what's going on.
Il y aura différents modèles de réaménagement des services possibles. Il a ainsi été résolu d'aller de l'avant avec une étude de faisabilité, du cadre de gouvernance, des implications financières et des aspects opérationnels. Un appel d'offres va être lancé pour retenir les services d'un consultant indépendant en ce sens.